Welcome to Two Trick Pony, a twice-monthly podcast where we explore all the ways that people have found and cultivated their second tricks, from gardening to glass blowing and everything in between. We're your hosts. I'm Melissa Betters.
And I'm Claire Ma, and we thank you for joining us. Each week, we invite guests onto the show who have broken away from expectations of their training, education, or CV to find fulfilling hobbies or even entirely new careers.
We take a look at how cultivating a multifaceted self can lead you to community, connection, and confidence.
This week, we're going to be joined by Honor Hawkins. She is a landscape designer and garden consultant in New York City who specializes in urban gardening. With a college degree in history and a prior career in art museums and news media, she has a lot to say about the experience of making a major career pivot.
Before our interview with Honor, we wanted to give a brief history of what we'll be talking about today, which is gardening. So first, you're going to hear a lot of terms thrown around in today's episode that might be helpful to clarify up top. First is the term horticulture, which is the art and science of growing plants, usually on a much smaller scale than agriculture, which is meant to produce enough food to feed a population. Horticulturists learn how and where plants grow best. Gardening, on the other hand, is the practice of growing and cultivating plants in a specific plot of land, either for recreation, aesthetics, or to produce food on a very local scale.
So all gardening employs principles of horticulture, but not all horticulture is gardening.
Yes, exactly. And the history of horticulture goes back a long time, as you might expect. When humans first started cultivating food crops around 10,000 years ago, there wasn't a ton of distinction between agriculture and horticulture. But as people started settling into new urbanizing landscapes, we see evidence of pleasure gardens starting to crop up around 6000 BCE in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians grew gardens around their temples and palaces, and were the first to add decorative elements like canals, courtyards, rows of trees, and fragrant plants. They also borrowed irrigation techniques developed by the ancient Sumerians. The Greeks were also among the earliest gardeners in the Western world, incorporating grottos, mosaics, sculptures, and fountains into their gardens.
We still see a lot of those elements in gardens today.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why that might be the case is actually because of the Roman Empire. So when Rome conquered both Egypt and Greece around the 1st century BCE, Roman gardeners incorporated a lot of these previous garden features into their designs. These gardens were then later recreated by Renaissance gardeners in the 15th century, which then inspired both French and English gardeners in the 1700s, like William Kent and André Le Nôtre.
Western gardening in the 1700s also saw a lot of non-European influences, like Chinese gardens, which became popular throughout Europe at the same time as other chinoiserie art styles. These gardens were all about recreating a spiritual journey through winding pathways, sweeping views, and hidden surprises and secret places throughout. André Le Nôtre, who designed the gardens at Versailles, incorporated the idea of adding secret places around his gardens. And there's even a pagoda at the Kew Royal Botanical Gardens near London, which was built in 1762.
And taking all of these traditions together, we get to modern-day gardening and landscape design following the Industrial Revolution. So this period saw rapid urbanization, and there was a huge need for urban green spaces to get people back into nature. This is also where you see support growing for publicly accessible parks, which we take for granted now, but were not the norm at the time. One of those proponents was Frederick Olmsted, who helped design New York City's Central Park.
And now we are in a postmodern era of gardening that started back in the 1960s and 70s, which is all about sustainability, like using native plants, sustainable materials, and low-intervention garden techniques. And with that, we'll turn to our interview with Honor Hawkins, who is a landscape designer based in New York City. So welcome, Honor Hawkins, to Two Trick Pony. We wanted to just start off with a question about yourself. So if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, what do you do, and what we're going to talk about today.
Thanks for having me on the show. Exciting to be here, my first podcast ever. My name is Honor Hawkins. I recently went through a career pivot. I was working as a technical writer for a major news organization here in New York City, and not for the newspaper itself, but was on the business side. And then I made the switch to horticulture and landscape design.
So we want to hear a little bit more about that moment. If you could tell us a little bit more about your first encounter with even just like the idea of moving into something like horticulture and landscape design.
Yeah, I have been thinking about changing my career for a while, but nothing really stood out to me as something that I wanted to pursue for a long time. And the way that I chose horticulture and landscape design was literally through watching one documentary about a really impressive man. And it was 2020. I watched this documentary alone in my apartment, very isolated at the time, was working from home every day, hadn't been in the office for months and months. And I watched this documentary, someone recommended it to me, about this man named Francis Cabot, who is a very famous landscape designer and plantsman, as they say in the field. And he was talking mostly about his garden in Quebec called Le Quatre Vents. And just the way that he talked about growing this garden, developing, cultivating this garden over so many years, like it was his magnum opus, this was his life's work. He was like a philosopher. He was like a Buddhist monk or something, like just the way that he approached his craft. And I also just loved his story. He's a great story about a career pivot because he started on Wall Street, very privileged man, grew up with, a lot of money, went to Wall Street, which I believe was his like family, business essentially. And he said he had one bad deal and he said, screw this. I don't want to do this anymore. That sucked. I'm just going to be a gardener now.
Do you remember the name of the documentary?
Yes, it's called The Gardener. So he made the switch himself, kind of late in life. I think he was in his 30s as well. And he just loved alpine plants. He loved going to the Alps and skiing. He was a big outdoorsman as well. So he chose this passion and decided to cultivate alpine plants and become a gardener. And he's made amazing gardens all over the world. And then as I was learning about him, I found out he had a garden in upstate New York that I could easily drive to in like an hour outside of the city. That's how I found Stonecrop Gardens.
Was it like a serendipitous thing that you came across this documentary, or did you already kind of have interest in potentially moving to something else?
So I started my career in museum education, and I really wanted to do that when I moved to New York City and was working at museums here and sort of swiftly realized, I have to go back to grad school if I want to compete with anyone in this field here in New York City. And I didn't really want to do that at the time. I really wasn't putting too much thought into my career. I wasn't like focused enough on it. So it was kind of like one day I woke up in 2019 and I was like, I don't really feel passionate about the career I have now. And I really wanted to do something more creative because I am a creative person. I think we're all creative. It's just whether or not we tap into it. But I was starting to explore in other ways outside of like pivoting my career. I was like, well, maybe I can be more creative outside of my work life. And like work can be work and it can just be a paycheck. I'll just show up, get my paycheck and go home. So I started doing things like I started taking drum lessons because I love music and it's been a long time since I've played an instrument and like played at the Bowery Electric with my friend's band. And like that was really fun and kind of proved to me that I could learn something new, that my brain wasn't calcified because I was, inching closer to 30, that actually I could learn a lot of new skills and my brain wasn't dead yet. Then I also started taking a nonfiction writing workshop where I was like every week bringing a piece of writing to this group of women. It was all women. And we were basically like writing chunks of our memoirs. And I really enjoyed talking to other people interested in writing, but it made me realize I don't have enough life lived yet to write an interesting memoir. Like I was writing about the history of my grandparents, and that's interesting because like my grandfather was interned in the Japanese internment camps. that's an interesting history, but like, it's not my story. It's not really my history. And then I came to a point where I realized, like, okay, it's really fun to do this in my free time, to have these hobbies, these creative hobbies, but work is like my life. It's a huge chunk of my life. And I'm just not the type of person who can like show up to work and get my paycheck and be done and leave it at the door. Work is me. My career is a huge part of my identity and like how I express myself.
So going back to something you mentioned before, your first visit to Stonecrop Gardens, can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, really is kind of the beginning of this whole journey, because it was the first time I saw people working in a garden and thought to myself, I could do that too. Because when I finally went to the garden, I had just like the most transcendent experience. I just had a moment, you know, in the meadow, surrounded by flowers and bees and nature. And I just realized like this is something I really miss having in my life. I've always been really big into hiking and camping and backpacking. Like that's what my family always did. I did so much yard work for my dad too. Like I felt like I was in nature a lot growing up, and I had really missed it. And then as I was walking around the garden, I saw someone who looked like they had a lot of authority. I later learned it was Caroline Burgess, who's the director of the garden. And she was teaching young people how to like plant something in the garden. And so I later that night, after this amazing experience, like went on their website and found out they had an internship program where I would get to learn all about gardening and horticulture. And it wasn't necessarily about landscape design, which I was interested in, but hadn't quite like gotten to that point yet. But it was like all of these skills listed as things you would develop in this internship. And they were all skills that I just wanted to have, regardless of whether or not I'd become a professional gardener. Like, I just really wanted to know how people garden. What does that look like every season? How do you know what to do? And like, oh my God, like they can identify all these plants. That's so interesting. I want to do that too. It felt like a superpower or something. And so I just filed that in the back of my head in 2020. And there was a kind of a moment in my life of kind of the perfect timing, like kismet, where my landlord called me and said I had to move out of my apartment in New York. And so that kind of forced my hand into like making a big change in my life. So I ended up moving to Colorado for 6 months. I lived in my sister's house to save up a bunch of money, always in the back of my mind being like, to save up money so I can leave my job and do that internship. There's a lot of like financial things to consider when you're pivoting your career. So I did have to kind of like get myself in the right financial spot to do it. But it really took me like 6 months of not paying New York City rent to like be in pretty good financial shape to put my current life on pause and do this program for a year.
Would you mind speaking a little bit more about your experience in that internship and what you kind of learned from it?
Yeah, it was such an empowering experience. I think because I made it happen for myself completely. I will say that I think they were really open to me because I had gone to Smith College, which is funny, because they modeled their rock garden after Smith Colleges. So I used to think like, oh, I just got my foot in the door because I went to Smith. But I'm going to give myself a little bit more credit now and say I just was able to answer those questions so passionately because I was so hungry for this. And then I flew out there to do a working interview, like actually work with them at the garden and meet everyone and see how we all jived. And it was just like the greatest fit. And they like didn't even wait until after my interview to offer me the internship. They were just like, we want you to be here and I hope you can make this work. And I did. I made it work. I like quit my job 2 weeks later and spent a few months like getting ready to make the move back to New York. I drove there all by myself and it was really empowering. Overall, it was an incredible experience. It was very immersive. I was there for a year and I got to live there. So I could wander the gardens, you know, after work. at night, anytime I wanted, really, the gardens were my home. So we had plant exams, and we did field trips, and we did projects. Like, it was very much like being in school. And then the other thing that I was really proud about is that I just took that chance to just, like, be obnoxiously friendly with, like, anyone in the field who visited the garden. And so I already left that internship with, like, so many connections in horticulture and landscape design.
You seem like someone who has a lot of creativity. How did you decide that you wanted to do this particular creative thing and not a different, creative thing that you had some experience in?
I think it was a little bit of, like, trying to be realistic. I think only the super special people get to, like, be professional musicians, honestly. And I've never been a great musician. I always approached being a musician as, like, just a fun thing. Like, I always just wanted it to be fun. I didn't want to take it too seriously. There's something about gardening and landscape design that I just took really seriously. I think it's because there's not that many people ultimately doing it professionally in the world. But I also think, like, in terms of, like, an artistic medium, plants as, like, a palette makes sense to me. There's just something that makes sense to me about that. And I also liked how complicated it is, because not only are you picking out plants that will look nice together when they're all blooming, but you're also picking out plants that are going to have year-round interest. Or maybe you're trying to achieve, like, a very specific aesthetic. And I really like the levels of knowledge that you have to have in order to make a design that's going to last a long time. And I think something that's so unique about landscape design is you're working with living material. You know, it's nature, so you really don't have much control over it. And I guess, like, that kind of goes back to this book that I love that's really influenced me, that actually my sister introduced me to. It's called The One Straw Revolution. And it's by this Japanese farmer named Masanobu Fukuoka, who basically said, like, nature knows best. Don't do much to your plants. Let them be, and they'll figure it out, and you'll have a beautiful garden, or you'll have a big, yield, because he was more agricultural.
Can you talk a little bit more about your experiences following the internship and how trying to find a job in this field has influenced your relationship with gardening?
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of a rude awakening for me, mostly just in moving back to New York City and just how competitive it is here in any field, in any industry. So after Stonecrop, I was unemployed for about a month before I went to a really great, like, jobs fair that the Metro Hort group puts on, which is, like, the professional group here in New York City. So I got a job based completely on some advice that I had gotten from people that worked at the garden who had been landscape designers. And they said to me, you should go work at a garden center or a place where they're selling plants to the public, because then you'll learn everything that's, like, actually available to people. Because at Stonecrop, I was working with, like, rare alpine plants a lot, not necessarily, like, your garden variety nursery plants. And then the great thing about these garden centers is they always have people coming in asking if people design gardens, or if they could have someone come out and look at their garden and give them advice, So I ended up getting a job at the garden center that I used to go to all the time when I lived in Brooklyn. And they hired me as a landscape designer without me having really any other experience except for this 1 year at Stonecrop.
And where do you work now?
I work for a company called Verdant Gardens, and they're a landscape design company. So now I'm kind of going back to horticulture in that I'm starting basically working at all of their different gardens. They have residential, commercial spaces. And then I'm also a junior planting designer. So I'm starting at the bottom, definitely starting at the bottom, working my way up. And yeah, the future, the goal for the future is to be a project manager and a designer at this company that I'm at now. And I think I'm well on my way.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because, right, we call the show Two Trick Pony for a reason, where, right, your first trick might be your former career or your college education history, and, you know, in your case, the fact that you worked in museums and in media. And the second is your current career after the pivot into plants. What do you see as the connection between these two things?
Yeah, a lot of what I was doing in my last career was like documentation. Which, like, literally writing a manual for how to use a piece of software or a tool, you know? And I really feel like that attention to detail that I needed to have, the ability to break down something complex and break it down into, like, layman's terms, has helped me immensely. I have to, you know, write up little reports of the work that I do at gardens. As a landscape designer, I have to write proposals where I'm literally like pitching my ideas. And the more clear that I write my ideas, the more likely I'll sell it. I mean, those are all like kind of those soft skills that I feel like everyone poo-poos a little bit. Everyone's like, I'm going to go to coding boot camp. Like, that's how I'm going to be successful. And I think so little emphasis is put on just like knowing how to write a sentence that makes any sense. And then the fact that I can really easily like pick up any software and like learn it on my own, just because that's like what I was doing, was just like picking up a piece of software and learning it and then writing a manual for it. I think that's really allowed me to learn the tools that you need to be a landscape designer very quickly. And yeah, also going back to my history background, I took Latin in college, and I think my parents were like, what the hell is she doing? But haha, joke's on you, because I use my Latin all the time, because I can be like, oh yeah, I know the difference between those two Parthenocissus vines. That one has 3 lobes, so it's tricuspidata. That one has 5, it's cinquefolia. Like, you get to draw these connections and learn, basically build your mind palace much faster when you have these other connections that you're making to past knowledge.
Yes, I can definitely relate to that as a taxonomist as well, right? I'm using Latin binomial names all of the time in my work, so I totally get that. What have been some of the obstacles that you faced along this path? And when you came into contact with those obstacles, what kept you motivated to keep going?
I think, honestly, all of my obstacles have really just been, like, financial. And I have a lot of imposter syndrome and scarcity mindset, right? To use those fun words. I'm always struggling with that. And I think that's always the downfall, is like when you make some super strict timeline for yourself, and then when you don't hit that timeline, you're like disappointed in yourself, or you think there's something wrong. I really had to develop my self-compassion, honestly. But luckily, as my experience in the field has progressed, I've had experiences that have really affirmed my knowledge and expertise, dare I say. So I really do feel confident now that I have something to share, that I have some knowledge to share, and that I've achieved something already, you know? And maybe I don't have to work so hard to prove myself all the time. So it's a constant challenge. I'm not saying I've gotten over it at all. You know, I still have moments where I'm like, what the hell did I do? But I'm already so much more spiritually fulfilled in my career now. Like, I have these transcendent moments where I'm like in a beautiful space. It's a beautiful day, and I'm like deadheading echinacea or something. And I'm just transcendently happy. Like, I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be.
Is there a moment that you can think of where you felt especially proud or excited about what you were doing or what you were accomplishing?
I think of this one project I had where I just really connected with the client, the person who I was designing a garden for. She just, you know, was a really open person and told me about her life and what she wanted the garden to be. And I just vibed with her, you know, and we ended up creating this really low planter. And my idea was to fill it with tactile and edible plants for her children. So we planted like lamb's ear, which is this really soft herb. We planted these like peppermint candy looking verbenas that were just super bright and like childlike. We planted woolly creeping thyme. So everything just felt nice to touch. And then there were all these bright colors, you know, nasturtiums and cosmos. And it was just like bursting with flowers and just so playful and joyful. And it did really well too. Like it loved that spot. It just grew immensely over the year. And I was just so proud of how it all turned out. And I think, yeah, putting together like my portfolio at the end of last year, just seeing all the projects I had worked on, I was kind of impressed with myself.
So one of the things I was going to ask you, kind of jumping off of what you just said, how do you think that cultivating this expertise that you've built, how has that changed how you think about yourself?
As I was saying, I mean, I just feel I believe in myself a lot more. The fact that I made this happen for myself, that I've just started to take myself more seriously, actually. That's what it is. I take my life more seriously in general. Not just my career, but my whole life and like who I am and how I present myself to people. I think before I had made this change, I was kind of always like, in a way, like apologizing for my very existence and like being in anyone's way or just like having a thought or an idea, you know? I think I didn't really have that confidence. And now that I've achieved honestly, just making the change was enough of an achievement for me. Even if I were to go back to technical writing tomorrow, I would still really feel I had achieved something. So yeah, I think my whole self-image has changed. I'm scrappier than I thought I was. Maybe even a little bit smarter than I thought I was, you know? As I was saying, like, my brain isn't calcified. I can learn for the rest of my life. And that's really exciting to me because it's really opened up my whole world. If I can learn how to do this it's been basically 3 years now, I could learn anything in my life. Like I could do whatever the hell I want to do. And that's really, really empowering and freeing. And just like, once I, you know, really settle into being a landscape designer, I'm really excited to see where my passion takes me after that.
You mentioned that you have some ideas about maybe where this might go in the future. What are those aspirations that you're still working towards?
I want to be a full-fledged landscape designer. You know, I am pursuing another certification through the New York Botanical Garden in landscape design. That's kind of like what's immediately on the horizon for me, is continuing along with Verdant Gardens and working my way up to being a project manager and a designer. Long term, I want a nice life where maybe I have a little pied-à-terre here in the city and a cottage upstate where I have my own personal garden. I do have a little garden here on the Upper East Side that is my pride and joy. But I think for me, like, I need to have my version of Le Quatre Vent. I want my magnum opus. You know, I want a garden that's completely mine, that has nothing to do with a client's needs or desires, you know, where I can garden the way I want to, because I have a particular style that I really want to express. And then it would just make my whole life if I would see my loved ones hanging out in that garden and enjoying it, like with fireflies and butterflies. You know, I have an image in my mind that I'm certainly trying to achieve that kind of has to do with the career, right? But because I feel like this career I'm creating is so spiritual, like, it's almost like the goals are spiritual goals.
Was there anyone in your life that was particularly encouraging to you or influential along this journey?
Wow, I feel like a lot of people who maybe wouldn't even know. Well, first and foremost, Caroline Burgess, who's the director of Stonecrop Gardens, she was trained at Kew Botanical Gardens, so she was really, really intense. Like, she would, you know, quiz you on the fly, like, be like, what's that plant? And you'd have to come up with the name, or she'd be like, what's that weed? And you'd have to know what weed it was and where, if it was annual or biennial. So it was really great to have someone who was like kind of like a taskmaster in that way, because I really respond to that very well. She would tell me, just enjoy this time. You don't have any other commitments to other people, really. Like, you can fully immerse yourself in this. And I was kind of like monkish in the beginning of my internship. And she's someone that, you know, I've just talked a lot with about being in the field, and she's given me a lot of advice, and she's inspired me. It's just cool to see her career, you know, as a woman. She started in the 80s, and there were not as many women working in horticulture. It was seen as a really blue-collar job. She shared with me an article that had been written back in the 80s, which was all about, can women be gardeners? And she was featured in it. And so she was a really big influence, continues to be a big influence. And then, even though he is not with us anymore, my grandfather was a professional gardener, and I think about him often when I'm in the field. And he is an inspiration to me. He had a really modest garden in San Francisco where he was growing a lot of like Japanese vegetables and herbs for my grandmother. And one day I remember being really little and walking through the backyard, and then I decided to go down the other side of the house where there was like a gate and an alleyway. And as I'm walking through that side of the house, which I'd never been to before, I just see all of these blooming birds of paradise, which, if you're familiar with that flower, is, I mean, such a stunning sculptural flower. And my grandpa had just made this little alleyway for himself, filled with these beautiful tropical plants. And it was just like this jungle. It was like this magical jungle for, you know, a little toddler or however old I was. That's something I think about a lot, is making those little magical corners.
Yeah, that's so beautiful.
So before we close out the interview, we'd like to ask you a couple rapid fire questions. So these are like
Quick questions, quick answers. So, the first question, English or French garden?
English.
favorite plant.
Japanese anemone.
Name one tool you use that you're unreasonably or emotionally attached to.
My Niwaki pruners that my boyfriend Matt got for me, that are also a collaboration with another brand called Noah that he's really into. So it's like a beautiful mixture of our aesthetics and tastes in a tool.
What is the ultimate gift to buy someone who is into gardening?
Oh. Seeds.
What's the potential next hobby or skill that you might consider trying?
Just any kind of like planter fabrication. I would love to learn more about making stone troughs or, covering planters with zinc as we sometimes do at work. Like I would love to be a little bit more creative in that way.
And finally, do you have any last words of wisdom that you would like to share?
Okay, this just came to mind. It's something I tell myself a lot, and it kind of inspired me to make this change, which is life is long. It's long, but it's also short. So you don't want to spend your life doing something that's like painful and dreadful that you don't like, that doesn't inspire you, because life is too short. But you also don't want to do that because life can be really long. It will feel really long if you do that.
Well, thank you so much, Honor, for talking with us today at Two Trick Pony. I personally thought it was really inspiring to hear your story and just to, again, reiterate that, yeah, it's never too late to try something new.
Right, so for our listeners, Honor and I went to college together. We actually went back further than that. We went to grade school together, and it's just been really fun to see all of the creative endeavors that you've taken. I think I knew that you had learned drumming, and it's been really interesting to see you take these kinds of risks and live such an interesting life. So thank you again for coming onto the show. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it was so nice to hear all about how your career pivot has taken you.
Thanks. This was super fun.
Thank you so much for tuning in this week. We will be back for our next episode in 2 weeks.
If you want to get in touch with us, or if you know a two-trick pony who would be a great fit for our show, please let us know by email at twotrickponypodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at twotrickponypodcast. Those are both with the number 2.
And if you liked this podcast, please rate us and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.